One of the most commonly asked questions I get from my students when they're trying to decide whether to learn Italian or Spanish is which language is easier? Now, I don't think that ease is a factor in deciding when to learn a language. I think that we should decide to learn a language based on our needs. For example, if I'm going to move to Latin America or Spain, it would probably be more useful to learn Spanish. And if I'm going to move to Italy, it would probably be more useful to learn Italian. With that said, concerning the grammars of Italian and Spanish, I think that Italian grammar is a little bit more difficult than the grammar of Spanish. On a world scheme, I don't think they're so different. There are a lot of languages where the grammars are much more difficult than Italian and Spanish, and the grammars of Italian and Spanish are very similar in a lot of ways, being that they come from the same parent language, which would be Latin. However, I do think that Italian grammar is more difficult than Spanish grammar, and I'm going to list some reasons why I think that is. When it comes to spelling and reading in both of the languages, neither language is particularly hard. Usually, when you see a word written down in Italian and Spanish, you usually know how it's going to be pronounced just by looking at it. Both languages are spelt as they're pronounced, unlike English in a lot of regards. But Italian is a little bit more difficult because we don't have a lot of indication about stress of words in Italian. For example, if I have a word in Italian like pallido, pallido, which means pale, generally most words in Italian receive stress on the second to last syllable, but that word receives stress on the third to last syllable, and there's no accent marking that the stress deviates from what it would normally kind of be. However, in Spanish, if I have a word that's stressed on the third to last syllable, and it ends in a vowel, S or N, then I do mark it with an accent to show the person reading it where the stress falls on the word. So Spanish is very user-friendly in that way, in that once you learn the rules of stress, there are no questions about where the stress of a word falls. In Italian, there are some words that are kind of tricky, and you just have to memorize that the stress falls on the third to last or second to last syllable. And even with some words in Italian, sometimes native speakers can't actually decide where the stress of certain words falls. There's sometimes disagreement about where the stresses of those words fall. Spanish and Italian are both gendered languages, which means that every noun in Spanish or Italian is either masculine or feminine. And that affects how our adjectives are going to agree in number and gender, and it also affects how our articles are going to agree in number and gender. In Spanish, there are only 4 articles, definite articles, for the word the. We have el, la, los, and las, which is masculine singular, masculine plural, and feminine plural. In Italian, there are actually 7 different ways that I can say the. So that, especially for somebody that speaks English where we only have one word for the, can be a little bit difficult. In Italian, we have the masculine singular il, but the word can also be lo if the word begins with ps, s plus consonant, gn, or z. We also have la if the word is feminine, and either feminine or masculine words can begin with l plus apostrophe if the word begins with a vowel. In the plural, I have e for masculine plural, but words that have lo and masculine singular become yi in masculine plural. And the feminine plural is le, okay? So that right off the bat is a little bit more confusing in Spanish because I have multiple different ways that I can express the. And that's a concept that both in Italian and Spanish English speakers tend to have a little bit of difficulty with because we really don't have gender in English besides in pronouns when I say like he or she, but for all intents and purposes, English is not a gendered language to the same extent that Romance languages are. Forming plurals is also a little bit more difficult in Italian than it is in Spanish. In Spanish, the rule about forming plurals for nouns or adjectives is very simple. You add s if the word ends in a vowel, and you add es if the word ends in a consonant. Now, in Italian, if the word ends in o, I need to change the vowel to e in the plural. If the word ends in a, I need to change the vowel to e, and if the word ends in a, the vowel changes to e. There are a lot more irregular nouns in the plural in Italian than there are in Spanish. For example, even a word like man in Italian, which is uomo, the plural is uomini. That word in Spanish, the corresponding word hombre, it's very regular in that it's hombres. Another example we have in Italian of irregular plurals is words that can kind of change gender when they go from singular to plural. For example, the word problema in Italian becomes problemi. The plural is not probleme, as you would kind of expect since the word ends in a, but it's problemi. We can even have words that have really strange plurals that are even more tricky than that. For example, the word braccio in Italian means arm, and the word for arms is braccia. There aren't really so many words that end in a in the plural in Italian, and these ones are just kind of a vestige of Latin noun cases and this like neuter Latin gender. So the Spanish language is a lot more innovative than Italian when it comes to these irregular plurals. The word for problem in Spanish is problema, and the word for problems is problemas. The use of partitives in Italian is also something that's not really seen in Spanish so much. A partitive is a word that means some. It's kind of an unspecified quantity of something. For example, if you say in Italian, I have water, you would really say, oh, dell'acqua, which would mean, I guess in English, I have some water. It sounds kind of like incomplete if you say, oh, acqua. There's something kind of missing from the sentence. And those partitives in Italian, they're combinations of di plus some kind of article. And the ways in which those combine in Italian tend to trip beginners up. And we only have two contractions of prepositions and articles in Spanish, which de plus el becomes del, and a plus el becomes al. In Italian, there are tons. Di plus il becomes del, di plus lo becomes dello. There are tons and tons and tons of these contractions in Italian, and people tend to get a little bit confused about them when they first start learning the language. Italian verbs also tend to be a little bit more conservative than Spanish verbs, and because of that they tend to be a little bit trickier because they tend to deviate a bit more than Spanish verbs. A good example of a verb that does that is the verb to be able, which in Spanish is poder, and then in Italian is potere. In Spanish, the verb is stem changing, but it's still pretty regular. It doesn't have any kind of drastic sound changes. It's conjugated as puedo, puedes, puede, podemos, podeis, and pueden. In Italian, the verb is conjugated as posso, puoi, può, possiamo, potete, and possono. So we can see the shift in the T, in the infinitive in Italian, and it becomes an S in certain places, which resembles the Latin verb of to be able a lot more closely, but it creates a kind of difficulty for people that speak English because the sound shifts that happen in Italian are more drastic than the ones that happen in Spanish. Verb forms in Italian tend to deviate to a higher degree than the ones in Spanish. I can't say that any of them deviate like in an extremely crazy way, but another good example is a verb in Italian like the verb bere, which means to drink. In Old Italian or Latin, it would probably be something like bevere or bevere. I don't actually know where the stress would be. And it's conjugated that way in Italian, even though the modern infinitive is bere. We keep the v sound in the conjugation, so it's bevo, bevi, beve, beviamo, bevete, and bevono. In Spanish, the infinitive is beber, and it really doesn't deviate. It's a normal, regular verb, and it's bebo, bebes, bebe, bebemos, bebes, and bebe. So we can see how this elimination of that v syllable in Italian, it's also something that's kind of unexpected if you're learning Italian as a second language. Both Italian and Spanish have a simple past tense, or a preterite tense, or passato remoto, and this tense is kind of tricky because it does have a lot of irregular verbs in both Italian and Spanish. The tense is used a lot more in the Spanish language than it is in Italian, but that being said, Italian does tend to have more irregularity in these tenses, and there are more verbs that are irregular in these tenses. For example, a verb like to be born in Spanish is nacer, and then in the simple past tense, the preterite tense, it's regular. It's nací, naciste, nació, nacimos, nacistes, nacieron. The verb for to be born in Italian is nascere, and the passato remoto is nacqui. So again, that's a kind of sound shift that's somewhat drastic. The similarity between a sh and a qua, it's there, but it's not really so expected or anticipated. Italian and Spanish also both have perfect tenses, which means they use some kind of past participle with some kind of auxiliary verb. In Italian, these tenses are definitely more difficult. Not only are there more irregular past participles in Italian than there are in Spanish, but also you have to choose in Italian whether you're going to use the verb essere or the verb avere based on whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. In Spanish, there's really no question about that. We use the verb haber no matter whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. For example, to say I have gone in Spanish would be he ido. If I say I have done in Spanish, it would be he hecho. In Italian, I would say sono andato, I have gone, and ho fatto, I have done. So the verb in Italian changes from sono to ho. It changes from essere to avere. based on whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. The past participles in Italian will also change based on gender and number. For example, if I'm a man and I say I have gone, I would say sono andato. If I'm a woman, I would say sono andata. So the past participle has to change from masculine to feminine based on who the subject of the sentence is. And that does not happen in Spanish. You say he ido, no matter whether you're a man or whether you're a woman. The past participles can also change in Italian for transitive verbs if I put a pronoun before the verb avere. For example, if I say I've done something and the verb is feminine, then I would say l'ho fatta, because it would be la ho fatta, which becomes l'ho fatta. So keeping in mind that these past participles in Italian can change to a much higher degree than they can in Spanish, and you have to choose whether to use avere or essere, then that creates a lot more kind of choice that can happen, and the rules are not always so easily remembered by somebody that's learning Spanish or Italian as a second language. There are a lot of other ways that I think Italian is more difficult than Spanish, but those are some primary reasons when you're starting off with learning a language that I think Italian tends to be a little bit more difficult than Spanish. And that's not to say that I think Spanish is an easy language to learn. I think every language takes effort and you have to dedicate time to learning vocabulary and trying to speak and practice and listen. But I do think that Italian is just slightly more complicated than Spanish.